Isabella started with nothing but a basket of wildflowers and a promise. She was 8 years old, and her horse Lucero had been sold to pay her family's debts. For 9 months, she stood on that corner, rain or shine, saving every peso in a tin box. When she finally counted out the full amount and walked to the wealthy neighbor's gate, what happened next made grown men weep in the street. Isabella was 8. Her family's debts forced them to sell Lucero, the horse she had raised from a foal. The buyer, Don Ernesto, a wealthy rancher just across the valley. Every morning she heard Lucero calling from his estate, and every morning she took her wildflowers to the village corner, saving every coin in a tin box. But what she didn't know was that Don Ernesto had already contacted a trader from the capital. She had only weeks before Lucero would vanish forever. To understand how an 8-year-old girl ended up racing against a deadline she didn't even know existed, you have to understand what Lucero meant to Isabella. He wasn't just a horse. He was the last living memory of her grandfather, the man who had placed her on his back when she was barely old enough to walk. Her grandfather had bred Lucero's mother on this same patch of land, had delivered the foal himself on a night so cold the water buckets froze solid. When he died 2 years later, he left the horse to Isabella with a single instruction: take care of him and he will take care of you. The Jimenez family had been farmers in this valley for 4 generations. They grew corn, raised a few goats, and lived by the rhythms of planting and harvest. But the year Isabella turned 7, the rains failed. Then the bank called in a loan her father had taken against the land. By the following spring, the numbers were impossible. Her parents sold everything they could: furniture, tools, her mother's sewing machine. It wasn't enough. There was only one asset left with real value, and he was standing in the back pasture with a white blaze on his forehead and a habit of nickering whenever Isabella's footsteps approached. The day Don Ernesto's men came for Lucero, Isabella threw herself across the stable door. She screamed until her voice cracked, begged her father to sell her instead. Her mother had to physically carry her into the house while the men loaded the horse onto a trailer. That night, Isabella refused to eat. She sat on the dirt floor where Lucero's stall had been, running her fingers through the straw, still warm from his body. Her father knelt beside her and said the words that would set everything in motion: maybe one day, when things are better, we can ask Don Ernesto to sell him back. Isabella latched onto that maybe like a lifeline. The next morning, she was in the fields picking wildflowers: chamomile, poppies, the purple clusters of verbena that grew along the fence lines. She arranged them in small bundles tied with strips of old ribbon. Then, without telling anyone her plan, she walked to the corner where the main road passed through the village, sat down on an overturned crate, and waited for her first customer. That was day 1. She earned 3 pesos, the equivalent of about 15 American cents. A neighbor woman bought a bundle out of pity. Isabella didn't care about the reason. She walked home, dropped the coins into an old cookie tin, and calculated how many days it would take to reach the 5,000 pesos Don Ernesto had paid. The math was crushing. At this rate, she would need almost 5 years. But she didn't cry. She simply woke up earlier the next day, picked more flowers, and added a sign her older brother helped her paint: flowers for Lucero. What Isabella couldn't see, what no one in the village had yet realized, was that Don Ernesto had his own problems. The wealthy rancher had purchased Lucero not out of cruelty, but as a business decision. A healthy young horse with good breeding could be resold at a profit. He had already placed calls to contacts in Mexico City, offering the horse to a dealer who supplied riding stables for tourists. The deal was almost complete. Lucero would be loaded onto a truck in just 14 days. The same morning Isabella made her first sale, Don Ernesto's foreman was drafting a bill of sale in his office. The two timelines, the girl's slow accumulation of coins and the rancher's swift transaction, were on a collision course, and the only person who sensed something was wrong was Lucero himself. In his new stall across the valley, the horse had stopped eating. He stood with his head lowered, ears flat, refusing to respond to the grooms who tried to tend him. The foreman wrote it off as adjustment stress. But an old stable hand, a man who had worked with horses for 40 years, pulled Don Ernesto aside and said something that would prove prophetic. That animal is not sick, patron, he is grieving, and a horse that grieves like that will not survive the journey to the city. Don Ernesto dismissed the stable hand's warning as sentimental nonsense. He had been buying and selling horses for 30 years. A horse was an asset, not a family member. When the call came from the Mexico City dealer confirming the pickup date, he instructed his foreman to prepare the paperwork and have Lucero ready for transport in 12 days. The price had been negotiated at 6,500 pesos, more than double what he had paid the Jimenez family. From a business standpoint, it was an excellent transaction. But the horse refused to cooperate with the timeline. By day 3 in Don Ernesto's stable, Lucero had lost nearly 30 pounds. He barely touched the alfalfa the grooms placed in his trough. He wouldn't drink from the automatic waterer, only from a bucket that reminded him of the one Isabella used to carry. The stable hand, a wiry old man named Tomas who had seen more equine behavior than any textbook could describe, spent his nights sitting outside the stall, talking to the horse in a low murmur. What he observed confirmed his initial diagnosis. This wasn't colic or infection. This was the physical manifestation of a broken bond. On the fourth morning, Don Ernesto's foreman called the veterinarian. The vet ran blood tests, checked vital signs, and found nothing medically wrong. When he suggested it might be psychological, Don Ernesto laughed. Psychological? He's a horse, not a poet. But the vet was insistent. He had seen similar cases. Horses separated from owners they imprinted on, as foals sometimes refused to thrive. He recommended returning the horse to its original family. Don Ernesto showed him the door. Across the valley, Isabella had no idea that Lucero was wasting away. She only knew that her tin box was filling too slowly. In the first 2 weeks, she had collected just 47 pesos. Her hands were blistered from pulling thistles out of the flower bundles. Her sandals were wearing thin on the gravel roadside, but she missed only one day the entire month, when a fever kept her in bed. Even then, she sent her younger brother to the corner with a bucket of marigolds and strict instructions to accept nothing less than 3 pesos per bundle. The rhythm of her days became fixed. Wake before dawn. Walk the hillsides picking whatever was blooming. Arrange the bouquets by color and size, 3 stems per bundle, tied with twine she scavenged from the market. Set up at the corner by 7 in the morning. Stay until the afternoon sun made the asphalt shimmer. Count the coins into her tin box each evening. The sound became her lullaby. The village noticed. At first, the adults saw her as a curiosity, a small girl with a stubborn dream. But as the weeks stretched into months, curiosity deepened into something more. The baker started setting aside day-old bread for her. The seamstress gave her a sun hat that had been sitting unsold on her shelf. Even the old men who played dominoes in the plaza began buying her flowers, tucking them into their shirt pockets with gruff nods of respect. Nobody believed she would succeed, but everyone wanted to believe. She became the village's quiet symbol of hope. And in a place where the crops had failed and the bank was tightening its grip on dozens of families, hope was in dangerously short supply. Then came the rain. The autumn storms arrived earlier than anyone expected, turning the dirt roads to mud and keeping shoppers indoors. Isabella's daily earnings plummeted. For 6 straight days, she sold fewer than 10 pesos worth of flowers. The tin box, once a source of encouragement, now mocked her. She had saved just over 300 pesos in 3 months. At this rate, even with her original calculations, it would take more than 4 years. And the rainy season had barely begun. She adapted. When the wildflowers grew scarce, she started growing her own. Her grandmother had an old seed collection: zinnias, cosmos, sunflowers. Isabella cleared a patch of earth behind the goat shed, dug rows with a stick, and planted every seed she could find. Her mother watched from the kitchen window, her heart breaking at the sight of her daughter kneeling in the dirt, talking to the soil the way she used to talk to Lucero. Don Ernesto, meanwhile, was running out of patience. The Mexico City dealer had called twice, threatening to back out if the horse wasn't delivered on schedule. Lucero had lost another 15 pounds. His coat, once a gleaming chestnut, had turned dull and matted. Tomas, the stable hand, had resorted to hand-feeding him mash made from soaked beet pulp, the only thing the horse would accept. Each morning, Tomas would walk to the stall, half expecting to find the animal dead. He decided to take matters into his own hands. On a Sunday morning, while Don Ernesto was at church, Tomas hitched his mule to a cart and rode to the village corner where the little flower girl was said to sit. He wanted to see for himself the child who had captured Lucero's heart. He found her exactly where everyone said she would be, on an overturned crate, a basket of cosmos flowers at her feet, a hand-painted sign propped against her knees. She was smaller than he expected. Her braids were coming undone. Her dress was patched at the elbows, but her eyes, when she looked up at him, held a determination that made him stop in his tracks. He bought 3 bundles. He paid her 10 pesos for each, far more than she asked. As he handed her the coins, he said, "These are for Lucero, yes. He is a very lucky horse." Isabella's face broke into a smile so brilliant that Tomas had to look away. He climbed back onto his cart and rode home, the flowers resting on the seat beside him, knowing that he had just witnessed something he could never unsee. That evening, Tomas did something he had never done in 40 years of working for Don Ernesto. He requested a private meeting. He told the rancher what he had seen. He described the child's patched dress, her blistered hands, the tin box she clutched as if it held her very soul. He concluded with words that hung in the air like a verdict. "That horse is dying because he belongs to her. If you send him to the city, you will be sending 2 coffins, one for Lucero and one for that little girl's spirit." Don Ernesto sat in silence for a long moment. Then he told Tomas to get out. But that night, the rancher did not sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, hearing the echo of a stable hand's warning and the distant, mournful cry of a horse who refused to be consoled. By morning, he had made a decision, not the one Tomas hoped for, but a decision nonetheless. He would go see this flower girl himself, and depending on what he found, the next week would unfold in one of 2 very different ways. Don Ernesto arrived at the village corner on a Tuesday morning, parking his truck 100 meters away so he could observe without being recognized. He wore sunglasses and a plain work shirt, hopping to blend in. What he saw over the next 2 hours dismantled something inside him that he had spent decades building. Isabella arrived at 7, her basket loaded with marigolds and the first blossoms from her garden patch. She arranged her sign, smoothed her dress, and sat on her crate. For the first 15 minutes, no one stopped. She didn't fidget or check her phone. She simply waited with the patience of someone twice her age. When a woman finally paused to buy a bundle, Isabella's entire face transformed. Not just gratitude, relief. As if every sale was one step closer to breathing again. Don Ernesto watched her exchange a flower for a 5 peso coin. watched her kiss the coin before dropping it into the tin. He saw the blisters on her fingers, the sunburn on her shoulders, the way she counted her remaining bundles under her breath like a prayer. He had expected sentimentality. He had not expected this. This was not a child playing at sacrifice. This was a child paying a ransom. He returned to his ranch that afternoon and cancelled nothing. The paperwork for the Mexico City dealer sat on his desk, awaiting his signature. He told himself it was too late to change course. The deal was done. Horse would adjust. Children were resilient. But when he passed Lucero's stall that evening and saw the animal standing motionless in the corner, ribs visible through his dull coat, those justifications felt thinner than the straw beneath his feet. The crisis arrived 3 days later. The dealer called to confirm the pickup, but with a change. They were sending their own truck, and it would arrive in 48 hours, not the following week. Something about a scheduling conflict. Don Ernesto had 2 days, not 8. He told his foreman to prepare the horse. Then he sat alone in his office, staring at the bill of sale, unable to write his name. Tomas saw the foreman's instructions and went straight to the ranch house. He didn't knock. He walked into Don Ernesto's office and did something no employee had ever dared. He placed his resignation letter on the desk. "I cannot watch this," he said. "That horse will die on the truck. You know this. I have told you this. The vet has told you this. And you are choosing money over life." Don Ernesto didn't look up. Tomas left the letter and walked out. Word travels fast in a village. By nightfall, a dozen people knew that Lucero was scheduled to leave. Someone told Isabella's mother, who decided her daughter had suffered enough heartbreak for one lifetime and said nothing. But secrets have a way of finding cracks. The next morning, while Isabella was arranging her flowers, the baker's wife let something slip. She asked Isabella if she had heard about Don Ernesto's horse trailer arriving early. Isabella's hands stopped moving. "What horse trailer?" She ran. She left her basket, her sign, her crate. She ran the 2 kilometers to Don Ernesto's ranch, her sandals slapping the dirt road, her breath ragged. When she reached the gate, she saw the trailer. It was already backed up to the stable entrance. 2 men in dusty clothes were loading horses, a gray mare, a young gelding. And through the stable door, she could see Lucero. He was being led out, his head hanging low, his gait unsteady. He looked like a walking skeleton. Isabella screamed his name. The sound cut through the morning air and Lucero's head jerked up. For the first time in weeks, his ears pricked forward. He strained against the laid rope, neighing with a desperation that silenced every other noise on the ranch. The men struggled to hold him. Don Ernesto stepped out of the stable, his face unreadable. Isabella pressed herself against the iron gate, tears streaming, her small fists wrapped around the bars. "Please," she gasped. "Please, I have money. I have saved everything. Please let me take him home." Don Ernesto walked toward the gate. He looked at the child who had sold flowers for 8 months, who had refused sweets and toys, who had turned down every kindness that did not come in the form of a coin. He looked at the horse behind him, an animal he had purchased for profit and was now preparing to lose at a loss in more ways than one. And for the first time in his life, a business calculation failed to provide the answer. He told the men to wait. He told Isabella to go home, to bring her tin box. And then he turned and walked back to the stable, not certain what he was about to do, only certain that the alternative had become impossible. Isabella ran faster than she had ever run, her heart pounding with terror and fragile hope, knowing that everything she had worked for would be decided in the next hour. Isabella burst through her front door, gasping for air. Her mother rushed to her, but she couldn't form words. She grabbed the cookie tin from beneath her bed, the one she had filled coin by coin over 247 days. The tin was heavy now, dented at the corners, the lid held on with a rubber band. She had never opened it to count. She was too afraid the number would defeat her. She just kept adding and believing. Now she had no choice. She pried off the lid and dumped everything onto the kitchen table. Coins scattered across the wood, pesos of every denomination, a few American quarters tourists had tossed in, even a single silver charm bracelet her grandmother had dropped in when she thought Isabella wasn't looking. Her mother stared at the pile, her hand covering her mouth. She had never seen the full accumulation. Neither had Isabella. They counted together, fingers trembling, 100, 200, 500, 1,000. The total came to 1,843 pesos, a fortune for a child selling wildflowers, but only a third of the 5,000 Don Ernesto had paid. Isabella's face crumpled. She had known the number would be short, but seeing it confirmed felt like a physical blow. She pressed her palms against the table and tried to breathe. Then she scooped every coin back into the tin, grabbed her mother's hand and said, "Come with me, please." At the ranch, Don Ernesto was standing beside the horse trailer, arms crossed. The Mexico City dealer's men were growing impatient. Lucero had refused to enter the trailer, planting his hooves and locking his legs. They had tried blindfolding him, coaxing him with grain, even using a lunge whip. Nothing worked. The horse stood trembling, his eyes fixed on the gate where Isabella had disappeared. Tomas, who had withdrawn his resignation when he saw the rancher hesitate, stood nearby, watching the standoff with grim satisfaction. When Isabella returned, she was not alone. Her mother walked beside her. Behind them came the baker, still dusted in flour. The seamstress, still holding her needle. The old men from the domino table. The children who had bought flowers with their lunch money. By the time Isabella reached the gate, 30 villagers had gathered behind her. They didn't speak or shout. They just stood, a silent jury, their presence saying what no one had the courage to say aloud. Don Ernesto looked at the crowd and understood. He was not just facing a child with a cookie tin. He was facing a village that had watched her sacrifice every single day for 8 months. A village that had invested its own hope in her impossible dream. If he refused her now, he would never again be welcome in the market, the church, or the homes of anyone who mattered. The power had shifted, and everyone knew it. He opened the gate. Isabella walked through, her tin clutched against her chest. She stopped in front of him and held it up with both hands, her arms shaking. "I know it's not enough," she whispered, "but it's everything I have." Don Ernesto took the tin. He held it for a moment, feeling its weight, the warmth of the coins that had traveled countless miles in a child's pocket. Then he did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He set the tin down on the ground. He knelt so his eyes were level with Isabella's, and he said, "Keep your money, I have a different price." Isabella's brow furrowed. "What price?" He pointed to the basket she had left at the gate, the one she had dropped when she first saw the trailer. "1 flower, just one. That horse was never mine to sell. He has always been yours. I was just too stubborn to admit it." Don Ernesto's voice cracked on the final words, and for the first time in decades, the wealthy rancher wept in front of his neighbors. Isabella walked to her basket, picked the most beautiful marigold she could find, and placed it in his open palm. Then she turned toward the stable. Lucero was already moving. The handlers stepped aside as the horse walked past them, his gait still unsteady, but his purpose unmistakable. He crossed the yard and stopped in front of Isabella, lowering his massive head until his forehead pressed gently against her chest. She wrapped her arms around his neck and sobbed into his mane. The horse exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that seemed to release months of accumulated grief. The village watched in silence. Several people were crying. Tomas removed his hat and held it over his heart. The Mexico City dealers quietly unhitched their trailer and drove away, their contract worthless in the face of what they had just witnessed. Don Ernesto, still holding the marigold, walked back to his ranch house and cancelled every pending sale. He would later tell his wife that the flower was the most expensive thing he had ever received and the most valuable. Lucero's recovery began that same day. Isabella led him home on foot, walking beside him through the village, past the corner where she had spent so many hours. He nuzzled her shoulder with every step, as if reassuring himself she was real. By the time they reached her family's pasture, he was already eating from her hand, the first full meal he had accepted in weeks. Within a month, his weight returned. Within 3, you would never have known he had been at death's door. But the story didn't end there. Don Ernesto, changed by the experience, did something no one expected. He called a meeting of the village's indebted farmers and offered to restructure their loans at 0% interest. He told them the marigold had taught him something his accountants never could, that a community's survival mattered more than a balance sheet. It was the beginning of a transformation that would reshape the valley. And Isabella, she kept selling flowers. Not because she needed to anymore, but because she had discovered something during those 8 months on the corner. She had a gift for growing things. The patch behind the goat shed expanded into a 1/4-acre garden, then a 1/2 acre. By the time she was 15, she was supplying flowers to 3 nearby towns. By 18, she had become the largest flower producer in the region, employing 12 workers and shipping blooms across the state. She named the farm Lucero's Garden, and every bouquet she sold carried a small card with a simple message: "Hope is worth the wait." Some stories stay with you long after they end. This one begins with a child who lost everything she loved and a horse who refused to love anyone else. What should have been a tragedy became something else entirely. Not because of luck, but because a little girl decided that hope was a currency worth saving, 1 coin at a time. The truth is, Lucero was never just a horse. He was the living proof that love is not a transaction. Don Ernesto learned that lesson the hard way. He spent 30 years building a fortune, and one morning watching a child with a cookie tin dismantle everything he thought he knew about value. The marigold she placed in his hand that day still sits pressed in a frame above his desk. A reminder that some debts cannot be calculated on a ledger. Today, Lucero's garden ships thousands of stems every week. Isabella, now a young woman, still wakes before dawn to walk the rows herself. She says the flowers taught her patience and the horse taught her faith. But the village tells a different story. They say she taught them what courage looks like when it is only 8 years old and holding a basket of wildflowers. If this story moved you, take a moment now to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss another. Like this video and drop a flower emoji in the comments to honor someone who never gave up on you. We read every single one. Thanks for watching. We will see you in the next one.